For more than 3,000 years, the Tollens River in northern Germany flowed quietly through its valley. It looked like any other small European river, a winding stream flanked by reeds and willows, ducks paddling in the shallows, and the occasional cyclist tracing the dirt path along its bank. No one imagined that beneath its calm surface history was sleeping. Beneath the silt and gravel, thousands of broken bones lay hidden, silent witnesses to one of the bloodiest forgotten battles in human prehistory. The story began in 1996, almost by accident. A local hobbyist out for a walk with his metal detector stopped to tie his bootlace. When he bent down, he noticed something pale sticking out of the riverbank. It wasn't a shell or a root. It was a human bone, an arm bone to be precise, with a flint arrowhead lodged clean through it. That single moment, a simple act of curiosity, would open a window 3 millennia wide. The man, whose name remains private, handed his find to the local heritage office. Officials thanked him politely, perhaps expecting another random artifact washed up by the river. But the bone refused to be forgotten. When researchers examined it, radiocarbon dating placed it around 1250 BCE, nearly 3,300 years old. It came from a time long before the Roman Empire, long before Greece's classical age. It was the European Bronze Age, a world thought to be quiet, rural, and small. Archaeologists initially assumed the find was an isolated case, maybe a local skirmish. But the next dig changed everything. Just a few meters away, they unearthed another bone, then a skull, pierced by a bronze spear tip still embedded in the cheekbone, then another and another. Soon, the riverbank turned into a mosaic of shattered skeletons, weapons, and the debris of organized warfare. As excavation continued, the pattern grew undeniable. These weren't scattered burials or isolated killings. This was a battlefield, a frozen moment in time when hundreds, maybe thousands of people fought and died in the same place. Every layer of mud revealed more chaos. Broken weapons, crushed skulls, and bones showing brutal injuries. Sword slashes, spear thrusts, and club fractures. It wasn't random violence. It was combat. The numbers kept growing. First dozens, then hundreds of remains were identified. Today, archaeologists estimate over 140 individuals have been found. And that's just a fraction of the site. Less than 10% of the entire valley. Based on density and distribution, researchers believe between 3,000 and 7,000 warriors took part in that battle. In Bronze Age terms, that's a full-scale war. Nothing like this had ever been found north of the Alps. For context, most historians once described Bronze Age Europe as a quiet patchwork of farming communities. Small clans led by local chieftains who traded occasionally and fought over cattle or land. Nothing organized, nothing resembling an army. The Tollens Valley changed that story overnight. This wasn't a village feud. It was a military operation. Feeding and arming even the lowest estimate of 3,000 men required planning, logistics, and alliances. Science added more depth to the picture. When isotopic analysis, a method of studying the chemical signature in human teeth, was applied to the remains, it revealed something astonishing. These men didn't all come from the same region. Some had grown up in northern Germany. Others carried the distinct chemical fingerprints of the Alpine region, modern-day southern Germany, Austria, or the Czech Republic. This wasn't a neighborhood brawl. It was a meeting of distant groups, possibly rival coalitions, converging on a single river valley. The battlefield itself stretched nearly 3 kilometers along the Tollens. Most of the fighting centered around a shallow ford, a narrow crossing where the river could be walked or ridden through. In the Bronze Age, such crossings were strategic gold. Whoever controlled the ford controlled trade, especially in valuable materials like amber, tin, and copper. These were the lifeblood of Bronze Age economies, the raw ingredients of wealth and power. Holding that bridge meant holding influence. As archaeologists dug deeper, the picture of the battle became clearer. Wooden clubs shaped like baseball bats lay among shattered shields and bent spearheads. Some still bore burn marks where leather grips once wrapped their handles. Flint arrowheads were found in rib cages, splintered into fragments inside bone, designed to cause maximum pain and make removal impossible. Even a complete bronze sword was discovered, snapped clean through near the hilt. The broken piece lay beside a skeleton, almost as if it had fallen exactly where it had struck. Each artifact told a story of struggle. The crushed ribs, shattered skulls, and embedded arrowheads painted a scene of close-quarters combat. Men fighting hand to hand, chest to chest, in the mud and the river water. The oxygen-poor environment of the Tolens preserved everything in eerie detail, locking away the final moments of these warriors for thousands of years. To the archaeologists, it was like stepping into a frozen war. CT scans of bones revealed the exact weapons that caused each wound. Some skulls matched the size and shape of clubs found just meters away. Others bore multiple impact points, proof that the fighting was relentless. One skeleton even had a healed arm fracture, evidence that this man had fought before and survived, only to die here. The more scientists uncovered, the more questions emerged. Who were these people? What brought them here? Was this a territorial conflict, a failed alliance, or a raid gone wrong? The deeper the investigation went, the less the old textbooks made sense. Europe in 1250 BCE, it seemed, was far more organized, violent, and politically complex than anyone had imagined. The Tolens discovery didn't just rewrite archaeology. It rewrote humanity's understanding of itself. It revealed that even before written history reached Northern Europe, people were forming armies, forging alliances, and waging wars for control of trade and power. Civilization, it turned out, didn't start with writing. It started with conflict. What began as a man tying his boot beside a sleepy river had become one of the most significant archaeological finds in European history. A moment of chance exposed a story buried for 3,000 years. A story of blood, ambition, and the birth of organized warfare. And yet, as the first team packed up their tools at dusk, one mystery lingered in the fading light. If this was Europe's earliest war, what else might be waiting beneath the mud, still holding its breath beneath the river's quiet flow? The following summer, the Tolens Valley returned to life, not with warriors, but with archaeologists, cameras, and quiet determination. Early morning mist clung to the reeds as teams in waders and gloves stepped into the shallow waters, setting up grids, marking every bone, every stone, every fragment. The air was heavy with a mix of earth and time. Every shovelful of mud felt like a heartbeat from the past waiting to surface. When the first full excavation season began, no one was ready for what they were about to find. Within days, the team uncovered clusters of human remains tangled together, limbs locked in unnatural poses, skulls split open by ancient blows. The skeletons weren't neatly buried. They were scattered, thrown into the river as if discarded after the chaos of battle. This wasn't a burial ground. It was a mass death site. The warriors had fallen where they fought, their bodies left to rot in the current. Archaeologists meticulously mapped every discovery. Each bone was photographed, catalogued, and lifted from the mud like a message from the past. One skull bore a deep gash just above the eye socket, likely from a bronze sword. Another had 2 punctures from arrowheads, one in the jaw, one in the neck. Some bodies still had remnants of wooden weapons clutched in their fingers. Others were missing limbs altogether. The violence was overwhelming, almost surgical in its intensity. Among the most haunting discoveries was the partial skeleton of a young man, no older than 20. His ribs were shattered, his forearm fractured in defense, and a flint arrowhead was lodged deep in his spine. Around his neck was a small bronze spiral, a personal ornament, perhaps a charm. It was one of the few signs of individuality in a sea of anonymity. Someone thousands of years ago had cared enough to give him that. Now it lay in the archaeologist's hands, glinting faintly in the morning sun. The soil of the Tolense was a perfect time capsule. The oxygen-deprived mud preserved organic materials that would have vanished anywhere else. Wooden clubs, leather straps, pieces of textile, even remnants of horse harnesses, all survived. These artifacts told stories beyond death. They hinted at structure, hierarchy, and preparation. This was not a spontaneous clash. The presence of organized weaponry and strategic positioning along the ford suggested discipline, perhaps even leadership. Radiocarbon dating of the remains confirmed the timeline. Around 1250 BCE, give or take a few decades. That was the same era when the great civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites, were trading and fighting. But far from those famous empires here in northern Europe, an equally dramatic story was unfolding, one that had simply gone unwritten. As the excavation expanded, strange patterns emerged. Certain bones bore healed wounds, proof that some men were veterans, seasoned fighters who had survived earlier battles. Others showed no signs of prior injury, suggesting inexperienced recruits or conscripts. Among the debris, researchers found fragments of horse bones, hinting that mounted warriors, possibly an elite class, took part in the fight. One man's pelvis showed crushing injuries consistent with being trampled under hooves. But perhaps the most revealing discovery came from isotope analysis. The chemical composition in the teeth of several soldiers didn't match the local environment. Some had grown up hundreds of kilometers away, possibly near the Alps or even beyond. This meant that whoever gathered these men had the power to unite distant groups, a feat that required communication networks, trust, and authority. This wasn't the work of a local chieftain. It hinted at something larger, an early form of alliance or proto-kingdom. The river itself seemed to have swallowed the dead in waves. In some areas, bones lay in thick concentrations, suggesting that the battle might have been fought in stages. Initial skirmishes on the banks, followed by a chaotic retreat across the ford. Many of the skeletons showed wounds on the back, blunt force trauma, deep cuts, and arrow strikes. They had been cut down while fleeing. It painted a brutal image. Men trying to cross the water, slipping in mud, pursued and slaughtered as they struggled to escape. The archaeologists tried to reconstruct that final day. The ground would have been slick with blood and rain. The air, thick with the metallic scent of bronze and the screams of the wounded. Horses panicked, arrows whistled, and the river turned murky with death. By the time the battle ended, hundreds lay dead or dying, the current carrying their bodies downstream, entangling them in reeds and roots. When the victors left, the river became their grave. What fascinated researchers most wasn't just the violence, but the organization it revealed. Someone planned this battle. Someone commanded these men, positioned them by the river, and decided where to strike. That kind of planning required not just leadership, but a shared cause. Perhaps control of trade routes, political dominance, or vengeance. Whatever the motive, it was powerful enough to assemble one of the largest forces known in prehistoric Europe. Artifacts continued to whisper hints of a larger world. A single bronze arrowhead here, a bone comb there. Fragments of horse harnesses suggested that the fighters were not wild tribesmen, but members of structured societies. One broken spearhead bore a casting flaw identical to others found kilometers away, implying they came from the same workshop, perhaps the same armory. For the first time, Europe's prehistory looked less like scattered tribes, and more like a network of nations before nations. By the end of that excavation season, the site had yielded over 10,000 bones and thousands of artifacts. The valley that once echoed with the cries of war was now filled with the sound of brushes, cameras, and gentle murmurs. The bones were carried off to labs, the mud sieved for the smallest fragments of story. And though no names or written records survived, the evidence spoke with clarity. These men had not died by accident. They had died in the earliest known battle in European history. And yet one question hung over every discovery. Who won? The battlefield revealed only death, not victory. No side had built monuments or returned to bury their dead. No offerings, no trophies, no signs of triumph. It was as if both armies had vanished, swallowed not just by the river, but by time itself. The scientists packed up their gear as autumn winds swept across the valley, and the Tolens returned to its quiet rhythm. But the silence now felt different, heavier, almost sacred. Beneath that still water lay the remains of thousands who had once shouted, fought, and bled for causes we'll never fully know. And as the last crate of bones was loaded onto the truck, one of the archaeologists murmured what everyone was thinking: "We haven't just found a battlefield. We found the first chapter of European war." Long before written words carved history into stone, the people of the Bronze Age lived in a world both brutal and beautiful. It was a time defined by metal, by power, and by survival. Across Europe, small communities dotted the river valleys and hills. Villages of thatched huts, smoke rising from hearths. bronze tools glinting in the morning sun. Trade routes stretched farther than anyone imagined, carrying amber from the Baltic, salt from inland mines, and tin and copper from distant lands. The men who died in the Tolensi battle came from that world, a world where alliances were fragile, and the sword spoke louder than treaties. In that age, power was measured not by gold or written laws, but by the number of men who would fight beside you. Leaders were warriors first and rulers second. They proved their worth not through diplomacy, but through victory. And yet, the Tolensi battle suggests something greater, a coordination that goes beyond tribal skirmishes. Someone, or perhaps several leaders, had the influence to unite clans and direct them toward a single, bloody purpose. That was new. It was civilization's heartbeat beginning to form beneath the chaos. Weapons were sacred then, forged not in factories but in ritual. A bronze sword was more than a weapon. It was a status symbol, a mark of divine favor. The blade gleamed gold under the sun, and when drawn in battle, it flashed like lightning. To possess one meant power, and to lose it meant disgrace. Only the wealthiest or the most honored warriors carried such tools of death. Most fighters wielded simpler weapons, wooden clubs, flint-tipped spears, and bows made from yew. Yet in skilled hands, even these could end lives with terrible efficiency. Archaeologists have found that many of the men at Tolensi were not poor farmers forced to fight. Their bones show signs of lifelong training, thicker arm bones from constant weapon use, and healed fractures from old wounds. These were professional warriors in every sense. They lived by the sword and died by it. They were part of a warrior class that roamed the landscape, offering protection or destruction, depending on who could pay or command them. But the battle was not only about violence. It was about what violence protected, the flow of wealth. The Tolensi River was a natural corridor between north and south, a trade artery. Whoever controlled it controlled the exchange of bronze, salt, and food. Power over trade meant power over people, and in a world with no borders, that kind of dominance could make a man into a king, or break entire tribes. The society behind these warriors was layered and complex. At the top stood the chieftains, men whose authority came from both ancestry and success in war. Beneath them were their retainers, loyal fighters bound by oaths of loyalty and blood. Then came the farmers, the craftsmen, and the herders, who sustained the warriors with food and materials. Though most people never saw battle, they lived in its shadow. Their safety depended on the outcome of wars they never fought. Women, too, played unseen but powerful roles. Evidence from burials shows they held influence, adorned in jewelry, some buried with fine goods. In many Bronze Age cultures, marriage sealed alliances between clans, ensuring peace or guaranteeing reinforcements in war. Behind every sword raised at Tolensi, there might have been promises whispered between families, political ties, debts, or vendettas passed through generations. The weapons themselves reveal the reach of this world. Metallurgical analysis shows that the bronze alloy came from ores scattered across Europe, from the British Isles to the Carpathian Mountains. This means trade networks stretched thousands of kilometers, connecting tribes that never met, but depended on one another. The men who fought and died by the Tolensi were part of something far bigger than a single valley. They were cogs in the first gears of a global system. Their beliefs were equally profound. The Bronze Age mind saw gods in every stone, every storm, every flash of fire. Sacrifice was sacred, and blood was a language the divine understood. Battles were not just political acts, they were offerings. To die in combat was to serve both your leader and your gods. Many weapons found in rivers across Europe were deliberately thrown in, not lost, but given. The Tolensi battle may have ended with warriors casting their last strength into the water, praying for victory or forgiveness. In this light, the Tolensi River becomes more than a battlefield. It becomes a ritual ground, a place where life, death, and faith intertwined. When the fighting stopped, the survivors may have left the bodies intentionally, believing the river would carry the fallen into the next world. The silence that followed was not just grief, it was reverence. And yet in that reverence lay the seeds of something new. These were not isolated people anymore. They were building connections, hierarchies, and organized violence, the foundation of kingdoms to come. In 1,000 years, those same river valleys would echo with the clash of iron, the rise of cities, and the birth of nations. The men of Tolent never lived to see it, but their story was the prologue to all of it. The Bronze Age was not a dark time. It was a time of emergence, when humans learned to command resources, forge alliances, and wage wars on scales unimaginable before. The Tolent's battle was a glimpse of that transformation, captured in mud and bone. It was a mirror of humanity's dual nature, the drive to create and the urge to destroy. And as modern scientists pieced together their world, one truth became clear: civilization and conflict were born together. The march toward progress began not with peace but with power, and in the shimmering bronze reflections of those ancient blades, humanity first saw itself, proud, violent, and eternal. When archaeologists first began unearthing the remains from the Tolent's River, one question echoed louder than all the others: who led these men into battle? No written records, no monuments, no royal tombs with names carved in stone. Only fragments of metal, scattered bones, and silence. Yet, within that silence, subtle clues began to whisper a story, not of chaos, but of command. This was no spontaneous brawl. It was organized, directed, led. The battlefield shows clear signs of strategy. The fighting concentrated around a narrow ford, a shallow crossing point that forced both armies into close combat. Someone had chosen that ground deliberately. They understood terrain, movement, and the value of bottlenecking an enemy. This was leadership in its earliest form, not by kings in crowns, but by tacticians with instinct born of survival. The men who fought here didn't stumble into war. They were sent. Among the finds, archaeologists uncovered objects that hint at hierarchy. Fine bronze pins that once fastened cloaks, belt fittings of foreign design, and jewelry that spoke of prestige. These weren't trophies of common men. They belonged to those who commanded, the ones who could afford adornment even on the eve of death. In ancient societies, beauty and power often walked hand in hand. The one who gleamed brightest was often the one others followed. But leadership in the Bronze Age wasn't just about wealth. It was about charisma, reputation, and divine favor. The chieftains of this era were believed to hold the blessings of gods, the ability to speak to the unseen and interpret omens. Before battle, they might have led rituals by the river, offerings of bronze or livestock cast into the water to win the favor of the spirits. The men followed not only a leader, but a chosen one. As the excavations expanded, scientists began to see differences among the fallen. Some skeletons showed better nutrition, thicker bones, fewer signs of childhood hunger. These men likely grew up in privilege, nourished by power. Others bore the marks of lifelong labor, the scars of servitude. Together they formed an army not of equals but of ranks. That distinction speaks volumes. The Tolent's battle wasn't a mob of angry farmers. It was a structured force led by hierarchy and command. Even more telling was the range of origins revealed by isotopic analysis. Some fighters came from distant lands, hundreds of kilometers away. That meant diplomacy. Someone had the authority to forge alliances and summon reinforcements from across regions. You don't travel that far to fight for strangers. You travel for a leader whose reputation precedes him, whose voice carries beyond borders. Whoever led these men, they wielded influence that stretched across early Europe. And yet the identity of those leaders remains hidden. No name survived, no legend tied to the valley. It's as if the victors and the vanquished both vanished into the mud. Maybe the leaders died here too, cut down alongside their soldiers. Or perhaps they survived, retreating into obscurity, their triumphs forgotten when their tribes dissolved. In a world without writing, memory was fragile. Stories lived only as long as someone spoke them. When those voices fell silent, history dissolved with them. But we can still imagine their presence on that day. A chieftain standing at the river's edge, cloak whipping in the wind, bronze sword glinting in the sun. Around him, hundreds of warriors wait, breath clouding in the cool air. The sound of drums, the glint of shields, a call echoing over the water, not words of glory but of survival. That moment, frozen in time, still lingers in the bones buried beneath the mud. There's a deeper mystery too. Some archaeologists wonder if this wasn't just one battle, but the end of a campaign, a decisive strike that toppled an early power. Evidence of organized supply lines, weapon stockpiles, and coordinated movements suggests more than a border skirmish. It might have been a war between two emerging systems, one destined to shape the social order of Northern Europe for centuries. If true, then Talence wasn't an accident. It was history's first whisper of organized warfare, the prototype of nations yet unborn. Leadership here was more than military skill. It was about vision, the ability to unite, to command loyalty, to promise victory and deliver it. And even though their names are lost, their influence rippled outward, unseen but enduring. Every leader who came after, from tribal chieftains to medieval kings, walked in the footprints left by those anonymous commanders on the Talence River. Their memory is written not in ink, but in bone. The alignments of the dead tell us where they stood, how they moved, how they fought. Each wound, each fracture is a record of decisions made and orders obeyed. The Talence leaders may be gone, but their strategy lives on, carved into the battlefield itself, eternal in the mud and water. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all, that greatness can exist even without glory. That the men who shaped history need not have names to be remembered. The river holds their legacy, quiet, cold, and patient, waiting for us to listen. When the fighting finally stopped, the river ran thick with silence. Thousands lay motionless beneath the gray sky, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth, iron, and smoke. The Talence Valley, once a quiet passage for traders and herders, had become a grave. And yet even in that silence, the echoes of battle lingered. The survivors, few and shaken, turned away, leaving behind comrades, weapons, and secrets that time would soon claim. There were no victors that day, only the living and the dead. The victors, if any, had no reason to stay. They stripped valuables from the fallen, gathered what spoils they could carry, and vanished into the wilderness. No songs were sung, no monuments were raised. The dead were left where they fell, their bones mingling with the current. The river began its slow work, swallowing history grain by grain. Seasons passed. Floods came and went. The valley changed shape, burying the remains under layers of silt and peat. Grass grew where men had once bled. Deer returned to drink from the shallows, and birds nested in reeds that hid the bones below. Life carried on above the forgotten war, unaware that the earth beneath held the memory of humanity's oldest organized slaughter. For centuries, no, millennia, nothing disturbed the dead. The Bronze Age gave way to iron, then to empire, then to modern borders drawn and redrawn. The Talence River stayed quiet. People farmed nearby, built roads, raised families, never knowing they walked above an ancient battlefield. Time erased everything, the language, the tribes, even the reasons for the war. Only the river remembered. It wasn't until a modern age of curiosity and science that the past began to stir again. In 1996, when a lone hobbyist bent to tie his boot and saw a bone sticking from the mud, the silence of 3,000 years finally cracked. The find drew archaeologists, and the archaeologists unearthed history itself, piece by piece, bone by bone. The forgotten battle rose from the ground like a ghost exhaling its final breath. As teams dug deeper, the picture grew clearer and darker. They found skeletons stacked together in twisted positions, skulls shattered, ribs punctured, limbs severed. Weapons littered the site, bent spears, broken swords, arrowheads still lodged in bone. But among the devastation lay something more profound, evidence of organization, of logistics, of planning. This was not chaos, it was war, executed with precision long before written history. The discoveries forced historians to rethink the entire story of prehistoric Europe. For decades, textbooks described the Bronze Age North as a quiet landscape of small farming villages. Peaceful, isolated, unsophisticated. Talence shattered that illusion. The people who fought here were not primitive. They forged metal, traveled vast distances, built alliances, and waged war for control of trade and power. They were, in every sense, the architects of civilization's earliest conflicts. But for all we've learned, so much remains unknown. We still don't know the names of the tribes, the reasons behind the battle, or who claimed victory. The river refuses to give up all its secrets. Only 10% of the site has been excavated. Beneath the remaining mud, countless stories still lie waiting, silent witnesses to a war that defined an age. And in that uncertainty lies a quiet warning. Human history repeats itself because human nature doesn't change. In the bones of the fallen, we see our reflection. Ambition, fear, greed, loyalty, desperation. The same forces that drove those Bronze Age warriors to fight still shape our world today. The weapons have changed. The stakes have not. The Tolensa River is more than an archaeological site. It's a mirror held up to our collective past. A reminder that progress doesn't erase the instincts that built us. Trade, territory, identity, survival. These threads have bound humanity since the first blades were cast in bronze. When they intertwine under pressure, the result is always the same. Conflict. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Tolense battle is not the loss of life, but the loss of memory. Thousands died, and for 3,000 years no one even knew. Their stories vanished, their courage forgotten. Civilization built itself over their bones, blind to the foundations it stood upon. It took one accidental discovery to remind us that history is never truly gone, only buried. Today, archaeologists still walk the riverbanks, sifting through mud, mapping bones, piecing together the truth one fragment at a time. Drones scan the valley, satellites track erosion, DNA labs decode the ancient dead. Each discovery adds a brushstroke to a picture we may never complete. Yet even incomplete, it tells a powerful story that humanity has always been capable of greatness and destruction in equal measure. When you look at the river now, it seems calm. The water moves slow, reflecting clouds and sky, as if nothing ever happened. But beneath that quiet surface lies the memory of chaos, a battlefield frozen in mud and time. Every ripple carries the echoes of war drums, the clash of bronze, the cries of men whose names we'll never know. So, next time you walk by a quiet river or a field that's seen 1,000 seasons, remember this: history doesn't disappear. It only waits. Beneath every stone, every grain of soil, there's a story too old to be spoken, waiting for someone to listen. The Tolense Valley waited 3 millennia. Now we've finally heard it. And maybe, in understanding their world, their struggle, their choices, their silence, we might better understand our own.